and welcome to the Luminaries Speaker Series. We are thrilled you've decided to join us today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to mention. First, all participants have been muted and your video turned off. Second, this event will be recorded and made available later this week on our website. I'm now going to pass it over to the Dean of the Carlson School of Management, Dean Sri Zahir.
Thank you, Amy, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the special event celebrating disruptive innovation, something that's always important, especially so today. We hope we'll have a very free-ranging conversation with Tom Friedman. And the Carlson School of Management is very proud to partner with our friends at Augeo to bring you this Luminary Speaker Series to you. And I know we're all in for a fascinating discussion. To keep us moving along, I'd like to introduce David Crystal, the founder, CEO, and co-chairman of Augeo, and also an alumnus of the Carlson School. David, we value our partnership with you and the team at Augeo, and thank you for helping to organize this Luminary Series. I'll hand it off to you now.
Thank you, Shri. We are so privileged to have worked at the Carlson School and the Home Center for Entrepreneurship to have developed the Luminary Speaker Series. We really appreciate the relationship and have for many years. At both Augeo and our fintech company, FIG, we love highlighting innovators. Our purpose in this series is to highlight those engaged in disruptive thinking and innovation and that advance our world, literally advance our world. Our guest today is Tom Friedman. If there ever is a thinker that across so many vectors breaks new ground in the world of connection, collaboration, and influence, it's Tom. Tom's career in journalism spans 4 decades, as we all know, literally. He's a weekly New York Times columnist and a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winning author. The range of topics that Tom writes about is, for lack of a better characterization, just flat out impressive. From globalization to climate change to the future world of work, from domestic politics to world affairs, and the spectrum goes on. He has taken us on a journey from Beirut to Jerusalem, has taught us about the Lexus and the olive tree, shown us that the world is flat, and even took time to say, thank you for being late. He makes us think, challenges the status quo, and contributes novel concepts to help us move forward in a 3-dimensional way. He's truly one of the world's great disruptive thinkers, and we're thrilled to have him with us today. For those that don't know, Tom, and I'm a Minnesota person. We're based in Minnesota, although we have offices all over the place now. Tom was born and raised in Minnesota. He went to school in St. Louis Park, where he forged a lifelong relationship with Ken Greer, who's Augeo's chief marketing officer and an innovative thinker in his own right. And Ken is moderating today's discussion. So before we start, a very quick personal story about Tom. Tom will not remember this, but I remember it vividly. I had the privilege of my wife and I had the privilege of being invited to Ken and Jill's daughter's wedding. And we were sitting across the table from Tom and his wife, and there were a few other couples at the table. And we got into this discussion, and halfway through the discussion, Tom says to me, so Dave, what do you think is the next big thing? And for a guy who's never at a loss for words, I'm thinking, I would be nuts to answer that question for Tom Friedman right now. But I will never forget that moment. Whatever I would have said, and by the way, I put the question back to Tom, as maybe he will remember, whatever I would have said would have paled in comparison to what Tom was no doubt thinking. So among the many cherished lessons from the last 12 months is the extraordinary blessing of close friendships. It is with this in mind that I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce 2 great friends, Ken Greer and Tom Friedman.
Thanks, David. It seems like everyone who knows Tom Friedman somehow has a Tom Friedman story. He's just that kind of person. He's the ultimate people person, and I know this firsthand. He's a great listener. And a mutual friend of ours puts it this way: when you're talking to Tom, he makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. I think it's a hallmark of his journalism that he is indeed such a great listener. Since we're all friends today, I also have a Tom Friedman story to share. My wife and I have known Tom since middle school. When Jill and I got married, Tom was studying abroad at Oxford. Since he couldn't attend the wedding, we decided to invite him to the honeymoon. So Jill, me, and the not yet famous Thomas L. Friedman spent 2 glorious weeks touring Europe and cementing what has lived to be a lifelong, lasting, enduring friendship that I so much cherish. So Tom, I don't know if you can remember that far back, but we're delighted to have you here today.
It's really a treat. This for me is a threefer because I get to do a good deed for the University of Minnesota, from which I have an honorary doctorate. I get to do a good deed for David Crystal and Augeo, who have been so good to the community, and to my dear friend Ken Greer. So thank you for this threefer. It's a treat to be with you all.
Okay, let's jump right into it. We both, Tom, we both grew up in St. Louis Park, and you wrote about this in your recent book, Thank You for Being Late. You referred to small towns across America as maybe flyover country, or what was thought of as flyover country, but you found that it's in small towns where innovation and disruptive thinking is really flourishing. Tell us why small towns are of special interest to you and how they're fostering innovation.
Well, after President Trump was elected, like many others, I realized there were trends going on in the country that I wasn't aware of. And so I decided to devote myself to exploring, some of rural America and asking a simple question. Why does one town work and another doesn't? Because clearly we have towns that are rising from the bottom up, smaller towns, and we have others that are collapsing, from the bottom down. And so I went on a journey, and maybe to bring it closer to home, one of the places I went to was actually Willmar, Minnesota. For those of you not from Minnesota, Willmar is a town of about 20,000 people, halfway between Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the Dakota border. So it's west central Minnesota. Now, it turns out I have expertise in Willmar, Minnesota. David didn't mention this among my expertises, but one of my secret expertises, I'm an expert on Willmar, Minnesota, because in 1949, my dad's brother-in-law and sister moved from the Twin Cities to Willmar to start a small little steel company. And I visited Willmar for 50 years. So I had a lot of depth perception as a result of that, about Willmar and its evolution. Now, when my aunt and uncle moved to Willmar in 1949, Willmar was 99.9% white, Protestant, Catholic, German and Scandinavian descent, basically, and 3 Jewish families, one of whom was my aunt and uncle. So they were kind of the exotica back then. Anyways, I visited Willmar growing up every summer, every winter. My aunt and uncle came down, and I never forget, around 1975 or so, my aunt came down to the Twin Cities for a family event, and she pulled me aside and said, "Tom, I was in the grocery store on Saturday, and I heard someone speaking Spanish. She thought it was Martian, and she never forgot it. And I never forgot her telling me." Anyways, as I said, I visited Willmar all those years, and my aunt and uncle passed away about 10 years ago. And 2.5 years ago, I got a call from Dana Mortensen, who runs a wonderful NGO in Minnesota called World Savvy. And she wanted to come see me in my office in Minneapolis. She came by. And this was right when I was thinking about small towns, and I'd visited some. And along the way, she told me where she was working with her wonderful education NGO. And one of them was Willmar. I said, "Dana, I'm going to make you a deal. I'm going to give you a free lecture, and you're going to set up a day for me in Willmar, Minnesota, and we're going to do a deep dive on Willmar." So she agreed to that. And I called a very close Israeli friend of mine named Giddy Greenstein, who's an expert on small towns in Israel. And I said, "Giddy, have you ever been to West Central Minnesota?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, you're coming with me. We're going to Willmar." And Dana called her friend Hamza Warfa, who's probably the leading Somali in the state of Minnesota government. He runs a workforce for the governor. And the 4 of us got in a minivan, and Dana drove, and we went off to Wilmer. We were like the answer to a joke. So a Somali, an Israeli, a former Minnesotan, and NGO walk into a bar in Wilmer. So actually, our first stop was Wilmer High School. And the principal met us in the lobby, and he pointed to a giant steel map hanging over the lobby of the world. And he said that the beginning of every year now, students take out a ladder and they put little pins in this giant steel map of the world of where members of the Wilmer Senior High School class, graduating class, are all from. Because Wilmer today is over 50% Somali, Latino, and other African and Asian minorities. A town that in 1975, my aunt thought it was the most exotic thing in the world that someone was speaking Spanish. So I spent the day in Wilmer trying to understand why Wilmer works, because Wilmer does work. And what you see in Wilmer are all the attributes of why one small town is rising and another isn't. So what are those attributes? First of all, inclusion. Now, one of the things you learn from Wilmer is that invention, necessity isn't just the mother of invention. Necessity is also the mother of inclusion, because it turned out that Wilmer desperately needed labor. And when you need labor, you don't care whether someone is black, white, brown, what God they pray to, who they sleep with. All you care about are their social skills. Will they wake up, dress up, clean up, sit up, work up, learn up, and shut up? And if they will, you can get a job today in Wilmer, Minnesota. By the way, as an ag scientist or in the Genio turkey factory. So they were desperate for labor, and that necessity punched through a lot of traditional resistance, maybe to the foreigner. Second, Wilmer had a high concentration of leaders without authority. Leaders without authority are the most important leaders in the community. These are people who just step up and say, you know what? This is my town. My granddaddy lived here. My mom lived here. I live here, and I'm not going to let this town go. And so in Wilmer, they had a high density of leaders without authority who really wanted to work to build a community. So when the Somalis had their first Ramadan in Wilmer, there was no mosque in Wilmer. So they asked the fire chief if they could use the fire station for Ramadan to pray. He said yes. Some people in the community didn't like that. He said, too bad. These are new neighbors, leaders without authority. Third thing Wilmer had, Ken, was that the leaders without authority all came together into what I call a complex adaptive coalition. A complex adaptive coalition. So this is a term I coined from nature. Which ecosystems thrive when a climate change happens in nature? It's the ecosystems that forge complex adaptive networks, where all the elements of the ecosystem network together to maximize their resilience and energy and propulsion. Well, the same is true with human communities. Only in human communities, I call them complex adaptive coalitions, where the community comes together. The business leaders, like the David Crystals, come together with the educators, with the philanthropists, with the local government, with the social entrepreneurs. And actually, they create a coalition to manage the change. And Wilmer did that very, very effectively. The last thing Wilmer had was people ready to invest in their complex adaptive coalition. So Blue Cross Blue Shield came into Wilmer and basically organized a set of community dinners where anyone could sign up and go to a community dinner at anybody else's house. Anyone could host one. And they decided on what they thought the community needed most in order to advance. And then each community center dinner sent a representative to a larger community dinner. And they eventually voted on, these were 2 years ago now, I think it was 19 or 20 different projects. One was to help Somali mothers identify autism. They didn't have that skill. Another was to create a kindergarten that would be for elders and preschoolers together. And Blue Cross Blue Shield spent almost $250,000 2 years in a row investing in those community programs. I called Blue Cross Blue Shield. I said, why did you do that? They said, it's very simple, Tom. Healthy communities have healthier people, and our healthcare costs go down. So what you see in Wilmer is the microcosm of what makes one community rise. And down the road, there are other communities. One's called St. Cloud. Somalis call it White Cloud. Has not been able to manage inclusion or has had difficulties with it. If you can't manage inclusion, and you're a small town anywhere, by the way, you're not going to have labor. You are going to die as a community because a lot of your kids are going to move away. So to me, what you saw in Wilmer, Ken, is really the microcosm to me of what are the attributes of one community rising and another falling.
Another example of your keen insight, your ability to listen and draw inferences unlike anybody I know I've ever known. It's incredible. We've spoken many, many times about how important it is to you as a journalist, as a columnist, to quote, get it right. So help the audience today to understand how you choose what to write about. I mean, Wilmer, Minnesota is not top on the list, top on anybody's list. It's not even something that they know about, and yet, you know, it takes up a chapter in your book. But tell us a little bit about how you choose what to write about, and how do you know when you've got it right?
Well, I try to think of myself as a keen observer. I was a keen observer on your honeymoon, for instance. Oh my God, stuff I saw. Oh, Jesus. I won't even get into that. Well, you know, I've been working on something lately about how I learn as a journalist. Every journalist learns differently. And so, you know, one thing I'm curious about everybody. And I think that to be an effective journalist, you need two skills that at least I believe. One is that you have to actually like people. I like people, and I interview people wherever I go. As you know, Ken, I interviewed David at your wedding, and I remember the question I asked him. I know exactly what I asked him because I asked this question to everyone in a job like his. What's the new thing in your world? Where's the tip of your spear? I always want to know where the edge of the story is. So I really do like people. And I'm curious about people, and I will interview anyone, anywhere, at the Hertz rental car agent, you know, in line at the airport. Anyone who stops me is interview fodder for me, and they often end up in my books. And so, you know, my last book, Thank You for Being Late, began with me interviewing triggered the whole book, the cashier at my parking lot in Bethesda, Maryland. I came to my parking lot one day, and because I take the subway to Burke about once a week from Bethesda, and I park in the Hyatt parking lot, the public parking garage beneath the Hyatt. And I drove up, and the cashier said to me, I know who you are. I said, great. He said, I read your column. I said, oh, great. The parking guy reads my column. He said, I don't always agree. I thought, get me the hell out of here. But no, I said, well, that's great. I said, it means you always have to check if you agree or not. And I drove off and thinking, that's kind of nice. The parking guy reads my column. A week later, I came back, and same guy's there. Only this time he says, Mr. Friedman, I have my own blog. Would you read my blog? I thought, oh my God, the parking guy is now my competitor. What just happened? So I said, well, look, write it down and I'll look up the address. So he wrote it down. He ripped off a piece of cashier paper, a receipt paper, and wrote it down. I got home, I looked it up. Turns out he's Somali. And I said he's Ethiopian, and writes about Ethiopian politics from the perspective of the Oromo people, a real democracy advocate. And it was quite, it was good. It was rough, but it was good. Anyways, I wrote him a note that night. His name is Ayile Boji. And I said, Ayile, I have a proposition for you. I will teach you how to write a column if you will tell me your life story. And that basically led to a book of, you know, me explaining to him how to write a column, but then explaining out of that many more things. So that's the first thing I think you need to be a good journalist. I think the second thing you need to be is you need to be a good listener. And it's for two reasons. And second is more important than the first. The first is, again, what you learn when you listen. You'll learn a lot of stuff. And by the way, all the stories I got wrong, and I've gotten plenty of them wrong, were because I was talking when I should have been listening. So you need to be a good listener. The second reason, though, is that, and this really is more important, listening is a sign of respect. It's amazing what people will let you say to them if they think you respect them. And if they think you don't respect them, you can't tell them the sun is shining. So look, I'm a little Jewish guy from Minnesota, and I'll say one immodest thing. I'm one of the most widely read columnists in the Arab world. That's not exactly a natural thing, that a kid from St. Louis Park is one of the most widely read columnists in the Arab world. And it's not because I'm out there saying, you're all great, you're all wonderful, it's all the Israelis' fault. Actually, I'm in their face a lot. But they know one thing about me, and it is true. I really want them to succeed. I have very high expectations for them. When I'm critical, it's not to put them down, it's to lift them up. And it's because I deeply respect them. And because of that, you know, when the Saudi Crown Prince in 2001 wanted to put out his peace plan, he didn't do it through one of his trained SEALs, you know. He actually did it through me because he knew if it came through me, that it'd be read in a different way. So those are, to me, are the key. Now, how do I learn as a journalist? I learn, I think, differently from a lot of people. I learn by going to the edge of stories. I think the real learning happens at the edge of stories. And I've hung out at the edge of 3 different stories. One is the edge of, frankly, human behavior. This was by accident. My first journalism assignment was to be a correspondent in Beirut in the middle of a civil war. And boy, when you're living inside a civil war, you see how molecules behave at very high temperatures. You see what people are capable of by way of extreme violence and depravity and extreme kindness and generosity under extreme conditions. You get to see the full rainbow of human emotions. If you're a reporter in Minneapolis, you'll see some blues, some reds, some greens. You live inside a civil war for almost 5 years, and you will see the full spectrum of what human beings are capable of for both good and ill. So I hung out at that edge. I hung out at the edge of technology. The question I asked David at Ken's wedding is actually what I do. One of the ways I learned, and the way I wrote The World is Flat, was I went to India. I went to Infosys, India's then leading outsourcing company, hung out at the edge, and basically said, where's the tip of your spear? So I will go to companies and I will say, I just want to do 2 things. I don't care who your CEO is. I don't care what your stock price is. I don't care what your quarterly earnings are. I want to do 2 things. I want to hang out in your research lab, and I want to hang out in your HR department. There's pretty good chance that whatever's going on in research will ultimately manifest itself in HR. So my last book, again, was also inspired by the fact that Walmart asked me to be their speaker for their famous Saturday morning meeting in Bentonville. Once a month, they have this Saturday morning meeting in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is like the Ed Sullivan Show. It's a gigantic production. They asked me to be the warm-up act for Kevin Costner. That's true. And I said, his band, and I said I would do it, but I wanted to be paid, and I wanted to be paid a lot. But I'm not allowed by the New York Times to take money from a for-profit. So I said, here's how I want to be paid. I want to meet with your IT team. And I want to take my iPhone, and I want you to show me what happens if I try to buy, we agreed on, a 30-inch Panasonic television off Walmart's mobile app on my iPhone. And they brought their whole IT team together for me, and they walked me through every millisecond. And at that session, I got one of my greatest quotes of all time. It was from their chief engineer, who was explaining to me that when you swipe on Walmart's mobile app, it goes between 20 and I think 25 milliseconds when you swipe. And if it goes up to 28 or 30, they lose customers. But he explained that when I pressed buy, when we decided to press buy on that Panasonic TV, then Walmart's app manages an algorithm which decides where the TV will come from, which Walmart store, the warehouse, and how it'll be delivered. And there are like millions of options. And he said, once you press buy, he said, then we have all kinds of time. Then we have a second. I said, what did you say? He said, oh, then we have all kinds of time. Then we have a second. Then you have a second. That was all kinds of time for him. And that's why the book was called Thank You for Being Late, because it was all about how fast everything had gotten. And then he walked me through all the technologies behind that And that led me to all these companies that I didn't know about before, from GitHub to others. And that led me to the realization that all these companies started in 2007. And that led me to the realization that 2007 was the birth of the next century. And so it all happened because they asked me to attend their meeting. I agreed to do it if they would meet with the IT team. I'd meet with the IT team. So I hang out with the IT team, and I also hang out. I spend a lot of time at AT&T with HR, because pretty good chance, if you're Walmart and you wake up every morning and you're competing with Amazon, oh baby, you're right at the edge of the story. And pretty good chance, therefore, that however you're training your employees is coming to a neighborhood in Minnesota near you. Because whatever is going on in that HR department is going to show up in education and training. And that's at the tip of the story. And the last edge I hang out on, as you know, are ecosystems. So I've traveled the world for the last 30 years with Conservation International, gone to I've been from the Arctic Circle to the Amazon, at the edge of ecosystems, and really seeing the edge of nature. Now, when you arbitrage these three edges, I actually call it in my book Postcards from the Edge, which is a famous book and movie by Carrie Fisher a decade ago. What you learn at these edges is that there are three giant issues out there. They're called adaptation, diversity, and interdependence. How these countries living at the edge manage their diversity, Lebanon, manage their adaptability, Walmart, and manage their interdependence, all of them. Those are really the key issues. Whether you're Minnesota, or whether you're Walmart, or whether you're Beirut, or whether you're AT&T, can you manage diversity? Can you adapt when the story is changing at that edge? And how do you manage your interdependence? Do you build healthy interdependencies so you, your employees, and your community rise together? Or unhealthy interdependencies, as Dov Seidman says, so you all fall together? So that's kind of how I learn, and that's how I kind of look at the world.
Great, Tom, thank you. One more question about journalism, and then we'll shift down to some business-oriented questions. Journalism came under attack in the last several years. And so my question is, if you had to do it all over, would you still be a journalist today? And what role do you think journalism should play in today's society?
Well, I decided long ago that I wanted to learn. I went to graduate school at Oxford. I studied Middle East Studies, had a class of British Arabist education, and I wanted to learn, I decided, by being close to the story on the ground, not by reading historical documents in the British Public Records Office, So I always wanted to be a journalist, since, as you knew me in high school. I wanted to get close to the story. I'm really interested in how things work. Had I not been a journalist, I would have been kind of a plumber or a geologist. I'm interested in how the plumbing and wiring and plates move. I'm, in that sense, a real Marxist. I'm interested in the substructure. And once you understand the substructure, then you understand how the superstructure works and what's going to happen. So I really never wanted to be anything other than a journalist, and it's been a great learning opportunity. I mean, I have the best job in the world. I mean, somebody has to have it. I've got it, and you don't. I get to be a tourist with an attitude. I get to go all over the world and go wherever I want, write whatever I want, and have whatever attitudes I want. So it's an amazing job that the New York Times has given me, and it's really the most fun you can have legally that I can think of. I mean, illegally, I could probably think of some ways, but legally, this is the best. Okay, so it's great fun. Journalism has been under attack, in recent years. A lot of it was deliberate by President Trump to basically undermine the credibility of his critics. But also, we've had a lot of our issues. We've had a lot of them at the New York Times that we're sort of navigating through as a new generation comes into the business. And so I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I don't think our job is to be the resistance. I think our job is to report the news without fear or favor. And that's what I try to do. And so I'll just leave it at that before I really get in trouble.
So bottom line, you'd still be a journalist today.
Oh yeah, no, it really is the most fun you can have legally that I know of.
Okay, let's shift to business. The past year has been a year that is unlike anything we've ever experienced with the COVID pandemic. Business leaders and entrepreneurs and shopkeepers and everyone just like you was desperately trying to get things right in a world that was totally uncertain. You've talked to hundreds, if not thousands of people as you toured the country virtually in this case. What should be on business leaders' minds as we emerge from COVID? What should they be thinking about in order to prepare for the new next?
Well, I'd say a couple things about the whole COVID experience, Kenny. One is that what made managing it so difficult for politicians is that this was something they'd never really dealt with before. This was a natural systems event. Politicians, business leaders, they're used to market-driven events. This was not a market-driven event. This was a natural systems event. Mother Nature was in charge. And so one of the reasons President Trump struggled with this is that the only natural system he's ever encountered was a golf course. And he built waterfalls, artificial waterfalls on his golf courses. So he actually thought that he could dominate nature. And he also thought that if the market was going up, he was winning against Mother Nature. But that's not actually how it works. So because this was COVID-19, the coronavirus was one of the many fastballs that Mother Nature throws at her species, plants and animals, to sort out who is the fittest, who will get their DNA into the next generation. That's what she does. And these fastballs can be droughts and wildfires, extreme heat, extreme cold, floods, and in the case of humans, viruses, even though viruses are just other living things. When we experience them, they're fastballs. And when Mother Nature throws her fastballs at us, she basically asks you three things. One is, do you respect my virus? Because if you don't, it will kill you or someone you love. Second, she asks, are you coordinated in your response to my virus? Because I evolved my virus over millennia to find any crack in your immune system, either individual or collective. And third, she asks, have you built your adaptation strategy to my virus on chemistry, biology, and physics? Because that's all I am, says Mother Nature. I'm just chemistry, biology, and physics. You can't talk me up, you can't talk me down. Can't say, Mother Nature, we've been having a bad recession, the market's off. Could you take a few months off? No, I'm gonna do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And I always bat last, and I always bat 1,000. So is your adaptation strategy built on chemistry, biology, and physics, or on politics, ideology, and an election calendar? Because if it's the latter, I will hurt you or someone you love. When you're up against a natural systems event, the only choice you have is adaptation. That's who Mother Nature rewards. Who can adapt the best? So we kind of never got that right. Now, when the pandemic began over a year ago now this month, I wrote a very controversial column that a lot of people didn't like. I wrote that we actually need a strategy that is, when you're up against a natural systems event, there are only trade-offs. You don't get what you want or whatever. You have to make trade-offs. And therefore, we need a sustainable strategy for saving the maximum amount of lives and the maximum amount of livelihoods at the same time. If all you do is focus on saving jobs, you will condemn people to needless death. That would be deeply immoral. But if you only focus on saving every life, you will condemn people to deaths of despair, for bankruptcy, lost jobs, lost business, lost school opportunities. That will kill or harm many, many more people than COVID-19. So what we needed was a sustainable strategy for balancing lives and livelihoods. And I got this from one of my real teachers, Dr. David Katz, who really inspired this. Kenny, we never got that strategy. We never got that right. And I'm not turning this into a big Trump thing, but a big part of it was because we didn't have a president who could balance that. After I wrote that column, he took a line out of it that the cure can't be worse than the disease. But that's all he focused on. And so he encouraged people not to wear masks, to rise up against their government. Yeah, it was important that we don't just do, endless lockdowns, that we think about jobs and livelihoods. Because the thing about the coronavirus was that it affected a lot of people a little and a few people a lot. And therefore we needed to have a risk stratified approach to taking it on. But to do that was so subtle, so complicated, that you needed a national leader who could manage and navigate that balance from beginning to end. And we never had that. So we had a 50-state strategy. And the thing about the coronavirus, it actually doesn't know where the border between South Dakota and Minnesota is, it turns out. So without a national strategy for saving lives and livelihoods, we got the mess that we got. And all you can say is we weren't alone. Look at Europe, they've had the same challenge. It's very hard. I don't think there was an easy answer to this. I just think that we made it as hard as we possibly could.
We have a large contingency of students in the audience today. And so their career searches have been interrupted. Their education has been changed, possibly forever. What advice do you give people who are planning on entering the job market or seeking to make a change in an emerging from COVID kind of world?
First of all, my heart just goes out to all the young people who, especially kids who are in their junior or senior year of college or high school. I mean, they've just been completely hammered by the last 2 years and had really great years stolen from them. And my heart really goes out to them, and I don't have some simple answer. I just believe that it's pretty clear a few things are going to come out of this. One is it's a much more hybrid world is going to come out of this. We're having this Zoom conversation. There are a couple thousand people on the line from all over the world. And Kenny and you and I we're having a real conversation. This isn't like an artificial thing, If we were in person, it would be 100%, but this is a good 90% in terms of quality, I'm not going to go back to traveling all over the world to do these things, after this is over. It's going to be a hybrid world after. If we do this a year from now, it'll still be a great thing, when we can fly anywhere we want. And so I think a lot of things are going to be hybrid, there's just no question about it. If I were a young person today, I mean, again, one of the things that interests me so much is because this was a natural systems event, that this virus really emerged from the interface between wildlife, wilderness, and human population centers. Studying, understanding, working on those interfaces, I think is going to be a huge area of interest and opportunity. And beyond that, I'm rather old-fashioned, so I just think that if you've got your strong fundamentals, reading, writing, arithmetic, you can write well, you have a good grounding in math, science, literature, etc. I don't know where the next job opportunities will be, post-COVID, but all I know is if you've got good fundamentals, there'll be an opportunity for you. And so that's what I would be focusing on.
Since we're friends, I can disclose that you've had the limelight in your family for almost 4 decades, but there's an emerging star in the Friedman household, and it's your wife, Anne Friedman. She is working on a very, very noteworthy project. It's called Planet Word. So share with us just a little bit about Planet Word and how you plan on sharing the limelight with somebody who could prove to be even more famous than Tom Friedman.
Well, there's not a chance of that. I'm sharing no limelight whatsoever. No. I'm actually the good for nothing father spouse. The women I live with are awesome. My daughter Natalie is the executive producer of All Things Considered, a weekend on NPR. She's a great little journalist, a great rising journalist. My daughter Orly started a school in San Francisco this year in the pandemic. Was the first school in San Francisco to be allowed to open in the pandemic. She kept it open all year. It's called Red Bridge School. It's to develop agency, student agency. It's what it's built on at redbridgesf.org, if you want to look it up. And Anne, my wife, opened a museum in the middle of the pandemic. And we're so lucky to have Ken on the board. And it's the museum's called Planet Word, planetwordmuseum.org. You can look it up. And Planet Word, my wife was a reading teacher and believed very strongly that we cannot maintain our democracy without a literate reading public. And 7 years ago, went to New York and visited a museum there called MoMath, which was a math museum started by a couple of math quants, and came home and said, if there's a math museum, why is there no word literacy reading museum? And she decided 7 years ago to answer that question and built this museum. The mayor of Washington gave us a historic building at 13th and K, right in the heart of downtown, called the Franklin School. And in October, we opened Planet Word. She opened Planet Word. I'm the good for nothing vice chairman. And it is absolutely amazing. It's going to be the hottest museum in Washington, DC. People will be bribing Ken Greer to get tickets before it's over. And fortunately, we are reopening again on April 1st. And when you come to DC, it's the world's first voice activated museum. And it's all to promote reading, literacy, love of books, and love of language. And it's absolutely amazing. CBS Sunday Morning is going to be doing a special on it for their show. And it is just so cool. And it's going to be a great place, as I say, to promote community around love of words and love of language. So thank you for that promo, Ken.
It's okay. I think it's so interesting that you're in a business where words matter, and Planet Word is a place devoted to helping people recognize the fact that words matter. We have time for one more formal question, and then I'll turn it back to Shri, who has some audience-inspired questions and a few of her own. The last question has to do with your eternal optimism. You have covered wars, famine, 9/11, now COVID. And yet, if I ever need somebody who can give me a dose of optimism, it's my pal, Tom Friedman. How have you maintained this sense of optimism? And why should we all be optimistic about our future?
I use a lot of drugs. A lot of drugs. No, that's a joke. That's a joke. Don't tweet that. No, my optimism is unaided by controlled substances. Look, I grew up in a time and place, St. Louis Park, Minnesota, in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, where politics worked. I can't get that out of me. My mom was a radical liberal, as Ken knows. Mom was really liberal. And for 12 election cycles in a row, she voted for Bill Frenzel, who was the Republican congressman who represented St. Louis Park. My mom would never not vote for Bill Frenzel. And Bill Frenzel used to run for Congress, and he used to put up just a billboard on Highway 100, and he used to just say Frenzel for Congress and didn't say what party he was from. I grew up in a community where people never turned down a property tax increase to support the public schools, even when most of the community aged out and they had no kids in those public schools. In fact, the public schools in St. Louis Park radically changed in terms of religion, race and whatnot, and yet they continued to support those public schools. So I grew up in a time and place where politics, governance, community worked. You can take the kid out of the community, but you can't take that experience out of him. So if I ever write a autobiography, it would be called Always Looking for Minnesota. That's kind of what I've been doing all these years. And the reasons I got in trouble supporting the Iraq War for democracy reasons, not WMD reasons, is because I was always sort of looking on the hopeful side of things. I'm a sucker for that. And so that's in me. I have no time for cynicism. I didn't go into this business to be a cynic. I'm now a lot wiser. So I'm now much more into amplification. That is, I don't actually know how to fix Iraq, I've learned. Certainly no George Bush didn't know how to fix it. But what I do know is when someone builds an American university in Iraq, in Suleimania, I'm going to write a column about that. I'm going to use my column to amplify it. So I'm really into amplifying people doing the right thing now, whether it's Wilmer, Minnesota, or Suleimania, Iraq. And I hope that if I can use my column to amplify the right things, that maybe some of these ink blots will connect and from the bottom up, emerge into something more propulsive and cohesive for these communities. So that's kind of where I'm at. That's what I've learned, over these years. And I'll stop there.
It's always great talking with you. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Shri, who has a few more questions for you. So Shri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ken. Tom, I want to start by saying I love that you're always looking for Minnesota, but I've always thought of Minnesota not as flyover country, but that we fly over the East Coast and the West Coast to get to the rest of the world. So I'm going to take you from Wilmer, Minnesota, probably 30,000 feet up to the rest of the world. And the first question I have for you is you talked about managing diversity, adaptation, and interdependence. And how do you see the interdependence, the mutual enmity, as well as the great mutual dependence between the US and China evolving? How can we rise together rather than fall together?
Well, it's a very good question. I wrote my column about that issue this morning, in fact, in the New York Times. And you hit on what is the kind of mother of all interdependence challenges today. Because as I've argued for a while, it's America and China that are the real one country, two systems, not just China and Hong Kong. We've really become one country, two systems. We can't really rise if China doesn't. China can't rise if we don't. And this is going to be a real challenge going forward, for this reason. I believe the 40 years of 1979 to 2019 were an epoch in US-China relations. That will go down as a historical epoch. 1979, full formal relations to 2019. And during 30 of those 40 years, China, that era, excuse me, by the way, was an era what I call of unconscious integration. What I mean by that is any Minnesota company can wake up and say, I want to have a supply chain in China. I want to have a factory in China. I want my kid to study in China. I want to visit China. I want to hire someone from China to be a worker here in my labs. And anyone in China could say, I want to have a supply chain for a company in Minnesota. I want to have my company listed on the NASDAQ. I want my kid to go to the University of Minnesota. It was a period of unconscious integration, unconscious in the sense that people could just do it. Now, during 30 of those 40 years, China sold us what I call shallow goods, goods we wore on our back, shirts we wore on our shoulders, shoes we wore on our feet, solar panels we put on our roof, shallow goods. We sold China deep goods, software, chips, things that went deep inside their systems. And China had to buy our deep goods because they couldn't make them. Over the last decade, though, China started to, and by the way, when we just bought their shallow goods, when they bought our deep goods, we actually didn't care whether China was authoritarian, libertarian, or vegetarian, because who cared? We were just buying their shallow goods. But now when they can make deep goods, Huawei 5G, by example, microchips, we say, whoa. You mean your Huawei 5G is going to go in my sidewalk, on my telephone poles, inside the chatbot of my bedroom? So we suddenly said, wait a minute, if you're going to sell us deep goods, we need a different framework of trust to be that interdependent. We need a much higher level of trust. Now, it does matter if you are authoritarian, libertarian, or vegetarian. And that's where we're at right now. It's why the relationship is stuck, because they can make these advanced goods now increasingly and more every day. And we don't have the trust framework to buy them. And I think we've gone nuts overboard in worrying about China. I mean, some days I literally ask, like, what, could somebody explain to me what we're fighting about? I mean, does anyone think China is going to like occupy America? I mean, take over a Chinatown in San Francisco? I mean, what is it we're fighting about? And it sure is an ideology, because they're more capitalist than we are. So at some point, we do have to say, you know what, Huawei, here's the deal. We're going to let you wire, you know, St. Louis Park, Minnesota. We're going to watch you for 5 years. And if you're a good citizen, good corporate citizen, we're going to let you wire Mankato as well. You know, there's got to be some bridge of trust, and the same from the China side. We're heading in a terrible place. I think there are like 3 American reporters left in China today. And one of them is my dear friend Keith Bradshaw from the New York Times. They've basically thrown everybody else out. We've thrown out a lot of their journalists, and claiming they're not really journalists. But whatever is going on, so I do a lot of webinars in China. Just did one 2 days ago, the China Development Forum. I try to keep up my contacts, and I try to be as frank and honest as I can, and talk about things like Uyghurs in Hong Kong. But this relationship is in really dangerous disrepair. And we need to step back and understand the relative peace and relative prosperity of the world for those 40 years, 79 to 2019. At the heart of it was the US-China relationship. If that fractures, the world will be a less secure, a less healthy, and less prosperous place.
Thank you, Tom. That was very, very insightful. I think let me bring you to another part of the world where you've had much expertise. It's wonderful that you're the most read journalist in the Arab world.
One of the most.
And a question that has bothered me quite a bit is that, especially with oil receding as a factor in geopolitics, you know, why can we never hold the Saudis accountable for anything, whether it was 9/11 and now, of course, MBS and Khashoggi, you know, all of that. How do you see this playing out?
A lot of issues there, Shri, to sort out, issues which I have a whole bunch of history with. You know, let me start by saying that, you know, the Arab oil exporting states, you know, face a real challenge now, because, you know, Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the famous Saudi oil minister back in the 70s, once observed that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. Okay, the Stone Age ended because we built metal tools. In other words, the Stone Age ended with a lot of stones on the ground. The oil age is going to end with a lot of oil in the ground, okay, because people are inventing alternatives. That's not around the corner, but it is accelerating. And so one of the reasons the UAE made its deal with Israel, it's all about building a whole different basis for developing their people and their economies. For so many years, they just drilled the ground and tapped oil rather than drilling their people, men and women, and tapping and unlocking their creative energies, education, and aspirations. So that's a huge shift they have to make. Now, my history with Saudi Arabia is that after 9/11, I went to war with Saudi Arabia in the New York Times. I blamed them for 9/11 because of, well, actually, let me just stop and I'll go through this very quickly because it's a long story, but I actually showed up in Beirut as a cub reporter for UPI, my first assignment in 1979. The first 2 stories I covered, big stories I covered on my little typewriter. Typewriter, kids, is a device where if you press a key, it creates pressure on a roller and puts a letter on page. The first 2 stories I covered on my typewriter were the Iranian Revolution and the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Little did I know, those 2 stories would shape the entire region for the next 40 years. One sent Shia Islam on a right Islamist fundamentalist turn, and the other sent Sunni Islam on a right turn. And that right turn of Sunni Islam through Saudi Arabia ended up in 9/11. And so after 9/11, I went to war with Saudi Arabia and blamed them and their ideology for what happened. I'm not going to go through all the details. One reason they invited me in 2002 to give me the Saudi Peace Initiative was basically to try to shut me up and deflect me from focusing on them. And I was happy to do that if the price was a peace offering to Israel. What interested me about Mohammed bin Salman, and the reason I wrote positively about him, encouragingly about him initially, was because he was actually doing something no Saudi leader had done. He was actually fighting the war of ideas. And that is, over the years, we would come to Saudi leaders and say, you have to arrest Ahmed, Suleiman, because he is funneling money to terrorists. And the CIA would say that, and they would arrest him. Or you have to arrest Khalil, XYZ, because he's involved in terror. They would arrest him. But there's one thing they would never do. They'd never take on the war of ideas. Over what is Islam? Who owns Islam? Because Islam has many interpretations. And one is one that is highly compatible with the modern era. And that was not the one really being broadcast by Saudi Arabia or funded by the government. What Mohammed bin Salman did when he came in and letting women drive and getting the religious police off the streets and taking on these radical ideologies and changing the guardianship laws was taking that on very specifically. And a lot of people will say that's, yeah, but that, yeah, but no, actually none of his, weenie cousins would ever have done that. Unfortunately, none of his weenie cousins ever would have killed Khashoggi, rounded up every business leader and put him in the Ritz-Carlton, attempted to kidnap the prime minister of Lebanon. Unfortunately, he had all his upsides and downsides came out of the same thing. Both the crazy, outrageous things he did and the important things he did were rooted in a kind of recklessness, and my argument all along was you got to get the good side out of this guy, but cushion the bad side. This is what I would tell the Trump people. This guy really needs a coach, Unfortunately, they weren't interested in that. And he drove over a cliff. When you do something as evil and stupid as what they did to Khashoggi, and you have to realize how evil and stupid that was, there actually had to have been a meeting where someone said, I have an idea. Let's actually abduct this guy when he comes into our consulate and let's kill him. And then, I don't want to say what they did to him. You know what I mean? Like somebody actually thought of that, and then somebody executed that. There's a lot of things you can fix in this world, Sri, but you can't fix stupid and evil. You know what I mean? And so I don't really have much advice for Saudi Arabia these days. I don't really know what to do. All I know is they still are hugely important for the stability of that region. And because of that, to get to your question, how we kind of manage our relationship with them, not undermining them, but upholding our values has been a challenge for every single president, and it will be for President Biden. And I don't have a simple answer. I know one thing though, for sure, every answer is easier if we are completely off oil. Then we can be as honest and I think as helpful if we can be. And that's why I focus on that.
Thank you, Tom. That's wonderful. I know we're at time, but there is at least one question which a lot of people from the audience have asked. And I wonder if we can just take that. And, that's bringing us back to this country. And it's about, more than half the questions we received, and we received more than 100 questions, were about the future of the Republican Party and a possible strong third party. If you had to make a forecast for the next decade, could you make a quick forecast on where we'll all sit come 2031?
Well, it's interesting, Shreya. I was saying to my wife last night, we were out, and I just turned to her and said, honey, we're not right as a country. We're not right. We're really off right now. And what prompted it was, this may seem odd, but this woman, Sidney Powell, who was the leading propagator of Trump's election fraud myth, filing a legal brief to defend herself from Dominion voting machines company, who she claimed, were falsely, were falsifying votes. And her defense was that basically no rational person would have believed what I said. There is something so cynical about that. You have to stop and think about that. This is a woman who took what was maybe the greatest election in American history. A record number of Americans turned out to vote in the middle of a pandemic. A record number of their friends and neighbors risked their lives to serve as volunteer election polling station monitors. They counted the votes. Republican judges affirmed the veracity of those votes. And it was all in the middle of a pandemic. It was maybe the greatest election in American history. And this woman and this president went out and sullied that amazing achievement. And now they have the temerity to defend themselves by saying, or she does, that no rational person would have believed what I said. For shame. Absolutely for shame. But there's something deeply wrong. There's something deeply wrong with a party, fellow Americans who can just look and walk away from that. Now I have my own issues with the left. As you know, I'm a man of the center. What went on in Portland, some of this crazy woke stuff, I think is deeply corrosive. I'm not into that at all. But it pales in comparison to people who are ready to sell out our system for ideological advantage or to promote a party that clearly has so lost its way. Its only mission in life seems to be to troll liberals. We will only be healthy as a country if we have a healthy center-left party and a healthy center-right party. And, I couldn't travel during the pandemic, obviously. But if I could have traveled, I said this several times, the place I would have gone would have been to South Carolina. I'd have gone on a Sunday morning to a Black AME church, would have gone up to the choir and sat with the Black ladies in the choir and asked them one question. You saved Joe Biden's presidency. Joe Biden rolled into South Carolina and he was flat on his back. And you lifted him up, you slapped him around, you poured cold water on him, and you said, Joe, get back into the fight. And he did. And you propelled him to the presidency. Why did you do that? Because you wanted a Black vice president? You could have voted for Cory Booker. Why did you do that? I believe it's because they had some deep wisdom, the ladies in the choir, that they understood the country's coming apart. And they thought Joe Biden was the one person in the race who could actually bring it together. And if he did, it would be good for all Americans, including Black and brown and all minority Americans. So we owed them a huge debt. And they did something really, really important. Now, again, I have problems with some of the Democratic Party positions, but they are at least a truth-based party. They are a science-based party. They're in the game. We can work with, the edges of that party. You have a Republican Party where the senator from the state next door to Minnesota actually said this, that he wasn't afraid of the people who ransacked the Capitol because they were whites and they loved the country. But had they been Black Lives Matter people, then he would have been afraid. Really? You actually said that? And you're running for re-election and you think actually that will help you? Or maybe you just don't care at all. So until that party gets itself right, okay, and we have a Republican Party grounded in fact and science, we're not going to be healthy as a country. And the longer we go on like this, like I'd like to say, well, they have to be out of power for 2 cycles, then they'll come to their senses. We don't have time, not in a fast changing world. So I am all for getting rid of the filibuster. I am for making Puerto Rico and DC states, because we have one central mission to accomplish right now politically. And that is to send the message to Republicans that you can no longer get elected by trying to build a majority around the America of the 20th century. You have to build a majority by appealing to the America of the 21st century, a diverse, pluralistic America, okay? And if we have 2 parties competing for the 21st century America, not one appealing to the 21st century America and one trying to win by getting 50.0001 of the 20th century America. If we can have 2 parties competing for the 21st century America, we have a chance. I don't think, though, there's any persuading them of that. There's only one way to do it. You actually have to crush them politically by passing the filibuster, by making DC and Puerto Rico states, and sending the message that that old way doesn't work anymore, because there's only the new way. I did a column about this recently, and I'll end here. And it was about, I began by pointing out the connection between the deer in my front yard here, we have a lot of deer here, and the San Francisco School Board, which in the middle of the pandemic thought their priority was to rename schools that have been named for Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Paul Revere, Dianne Feinstein. And that was just stupid, frankly. Their schools aren't even open and they're worried about renaming them. But you know how come they do that? Because they have no predator. There's no Republican Party in downtown San Francisco. Just like the idiot deer in my front yard have no predators. There's no mountain lions in Bethesda. Imagine how much better off San Francisco would be if you had a Republican Party that was competing for the same multi-ethnic, highly diverse population in San Francisco, offering center-right ideas against center-left or far-left ideas. They would be so much healthier, and we will only be healthy as a country when we get to that point.
Thank you, Tom. That was extremely insightful. And in a way, you brought us back to Wilmer and what's been working there. I mean, it's exactly, we've come full circle. With that, I just turn it over to David Crystal to say thank you. I know we've overshot our time, but thank you all for being here. But this has been such a great conversation. So David, take it away.
Thank you, Sri. What an extraordinary spectrum of subjects. I mean, and I was taking notes, Tom. Complex adaptive coalition, diversity, interdependence, curiosity. When we think about the future world of work or just our future world in general, this idea, and even on the subjects of politics and others, this notion of connection and bringing people together is just, pervasive. And one of my favorite quotes is, "She drew a circle that left her out, heretic rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that brought her in." And it just seems to expand all these different subjects. And it just kept ringing in my ear. So Tom, we can't thank you enough. I mean, this was extraordinary. As an alumni of the Carlson School of Management, as part of the Home Center for Entrepreneurship, which is among the leading entrepreneur centers literally in the world today, and ranked as such, and as part of the communities that within Augeo where we really love to engage, where our teams are based. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Sri. Thank you, Ken, for all of you, as Sri mentioned, for attending today. Lastly, building on this notion of optimism, we wish you all good health and safe days as we move through this crazy, crazy, crazy intersection of work life, home life, and a healthy life. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. As Paul Simon said in Central Park, it's great to do a neighborhood concert.
Thank you.